it's time for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 3 years has shared with us her decades' research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative and judicial processes in America. And now, here's Mae.
This is Dialogue Conspiracy number 209. August the 11th, 1975. We were fooling around in the room here and talking, and I forgot for a moment to turn the mic on, but we're on and ready to roll. I'm turning out to be a terrible promise breaker this summer. I made a promise that I would do about 10 weeks of consecutive programs discussing Gerald Ford's book, The Portrait of the Assassin, about Lee Harvey Oswald, and we did one section of that book on one of the programs of Dialogue Conspiracy, but the current news just seems to take priority over Gerald Ford's description of Lee Harvey Oswald, and I'm forced to keep putting this off each week to keep up with more timely matters that we'll go into. Last week I promised that I would go into detail about H.L. Hunt, his connections to Jack Ruby, the Hunt sons, and the links of the CIA to the oil Hunt family in Dallas, Texas, and I also wanted to go into the terrorism, a gentleman named Carlo, who's being sought in Europe as the so-called international terrorist who would link all the various acts of terrorism together and piled on the lap of the left, and I believe that Carlo could have worked for the right-wing Ustashi. These matters I did promise to go into this week, but again, I have to put them off. I feel that there's more priority in going into an area that I've been delving into these last few weeks intensively. I can't get my mind off of it. I keep giving it as much concentration as I did the John Kennedy assassination, because I feel that I'm getting very much to the heart or the crux of these various conspiracies, and that they're all pointing to the Howard Hughes ITT connections to the Bahamas and to the manipulation of certain people in the career of Richard Nixon into an organization formed in 1970 called Intertel, the links to B.B. Rebozo, John Mitchell, Richard Helms, the CIA, and there's an interlocking here, and everything seems to lead to the very, very mysterious Hughes Corporation. And this is the area that I've been spending my time reading and researching. The evidence that came out recently of the assassination attempt on Castro is an indication of the way the CIA is linked to the Hughes organization in a very strange way. We know that former agents of the CIA, they say former, like James McCord and E. Howard Hunt, were using the agency after they, in quotes, retired continuously. At the time of the Watergate, they weren't former agents at all. They were working with the Central Intelligence Agency. The first thing that happened after James McCord was arrested was that a Mr. Lee Pennington had to go to his home and destroy evidence of the links of McCord to the CIA at that present time. And E. Howard Hunt had a desk at Robert Mullen's office. It's called Mullen Associates, a public relations firm. Robert Bennett ran that office, and we see that E. Howard Hunt went interchanging between there and the White House and worked for Hughes and worked for ITT, represented Hughes up at Chappaquiddick with Mr. DeMott. He was out representing the Hughes people when he saw Dita Baird in Colorado. There's an interchange here between the Hughes and the CIA and these particular agents. And at the time of the plans to kill Castro, only one example of the funding and the chain of command has been broken down under testimony that's been revealed publicly, and CIA officers, Mr. O'Connell and Sheffield Edwards, could hire Robert Maheu. Maheu, in quotes, former CIA and FBI, like E. Howard Hunt and James McCord, who then was working for Howard Hughes Corporation. And then Mr. Maheu is told, find Mr. Roselli, meet with Mr. Roselli, who's from organized crime, and the excuse to use organized crime was so that the CIA wouldn't be blamed for the operation. But Maheu was working for the CIA and for Hughes. And then they contact Sam Giancana, who goes on the name of Sam Gold, in Miami. And Giancana reaches Cubans involved with the gambling interests over in Cuba that used to work at the gambling tables. And then they were to hire a cook to poison the food of Castro. The chain of command goes somewhere. It has to go as high up as the president of the National Security Council. It goes to two top CIA officials, then to a former CIA, former FBI, currently with Hughes, Maheu, then to organized crime, then to the Cuban community. But always these interlocking people of former CIA and the Hughes chain of command. And I want to go into this because we keep getting tighter into the conspiracy. It's 1 year since Richard Nixon resigned. It's 3 years since Watergate was exposed, and we haven't touched that tip of the iceberg that McCord hinted, that E. Howard Hunt hinted, that Howard Baker hinted, and it has to do with the crux of it, has to do eventually with the Rebozo money, with Rosemary Woods tapes being cut out, the conversations, the funding of Hughes into the White House, $100 bills, 100,000 of them that don't draw interest for 3 years in the bank, that go to Rosemary Woods, that go to John Caulfield, and then to Tony Lasowitz, that filtered up to Chappaquiddick and into the espionage operations that have not been investigated, including the shooting of George Wallace or the killing of Mary Jo Kopechne. I think that these kernels, these threads, have to be delved in and delved into until each little corner is unturned, and the farther I get into it, the more complicated and the more simple it gets. And as it gets simple to me, and as it gets complicated in the threads they're weaving out, one pattern that I notice that is very obvious through this are the current deaths that are taking place of persons in the know or related or who would possibly know about what's taking place. I'm going to list a few of these deaths that have just taken place and threats of death that are linked in some way or could be linked to the political assassinations of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, which is very much in the news now. And yet these witnesses somehow have contacts with the Hughes Corporation, with the CIA, and they're dying so fast that the blame later can be put onto them and protect those people higher up in office. Now, we know that someone higher than a lower echelon is giving these orders, and the hint of it to come is the military organization that Gerald Ford is putting together. Christian Science Monitor had an article August the 1st that said, in comparison to the lawyers and the advertising men in the 72 elections, that they now have a Pentagon tinge, that they all have something in common. Mr. Callaway was the Secretary of the Army, graduate of West Point. David Packard is running the campaign for Gerald Ford, and he's formerly Deputy Defense Secretary for nearly 4 years. And Mr. Lee Choate, the Executive Director of the campaign, is retired Air Force, head of the Finance Committee. As Mr. Choate said, we all speak the same language. People say we've got a little Pentagon over here. Well, for those that believe that the 1963 assassination of John Kennedy began a coup d'etat, it seemed natural that by 1975 a little Pentagon surfaced, and Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission is running what he calls an election, which is no different than Thieu running in Vietnam or Parks running in South Korea. It's not going to be an election in 76 unless we wake up to how that little Pentagon got together and how they have manipulated various witnesses, from a president to a senator to a man like George Wallace running for president. But along with some of these conspicuous assassinations, there are other little stories happening, and again, they have a tentacle of thread that could link to the Hughes, and I want to read some of them to you because I think I know the organizations and the institutions that are manipulating this, and maybe we'll have time to go into some of them. There was an article just last week about Alexander Onassis's death. The son of Aristotle Onassis died January 22nd, 1973, and the New York Times ran an article. It was January the 20th that they ran an article saying that 6 people have been indicted in the death of Onassis's son, that an American pilot and 5 Greek aircraft mechanics were indicted for manslaughter. Donald McCusker, 48, of Westerville, Ohio, a commercial pilot, it was charged the wing flaps were connected to the controls incorrectly. Well, this death of Aristotle Onassis' son wasn't just a simple murder. We saw in a short time period that this boy died, his mother died, his aunt, and then his father. And the woman that he was living with, that he was supposedly going to marry, a Baroness Fiona Tyson, came out with a statement in the news just this week. And she said that she had to go into hiding. She has several small children. And she said Alexander didn't die accidentally. He was murdered by one of Senior Onassis's many enemies that was bent on vengeance. She said that she knows how dangerous the information was which Alexander confided to her during his lifetime, that he had information, and that she doesn't want to get involved in any of the investigations. The trial is going on to his murder now. She doesn't want to get involved in any of the investigations or into the real circumstances which led to the death and the murder of Alexander, that she knows what he knows, and that she now is hiding because she fears for her life. Well, I published an article in the Realist, not the Realist, in the Playgirl in December '74 with Stephanie Caruana, saying in that issue of Playgirl that Howard Hughes was buried by Aristotle Onassis April 18th, 1971, and I sincerely believe that the Hughes story, the kidnapping and the disappearance of a person known as Howard Hughes, who did not go to Las Vegas in '66, who was never in Vegas in '66, who either was flown out of the country and taken to Greece later, at a later date, or taken from the hospital in Boston directly to Greece. There was no Onassis in Hughes, and the Hughes empire after that date in '71 began to fall apart. And I just wonder if this particular Baroness Tyson has any information about what happened to Howard Hughes, if he was at that island and was buried there, and was Alexander murdered. What information? He was murdered because of information which he knew, and she said that was so dangerous that she no longer felt safe. Another person died connected to Watergate-related deaths. I once did a program on 27 of these particular deaths and mentioned one by the name of Lou Russell, simply because he was a friend of James McCord and worked for James McCord at McCord Associates when McCord left the CIA. And Lou Russell was described in the Boston Phoenix in 1973 as an old-hand security cop employed by McCord Associates for the Republican Convention security contract. The article went on to say he brought a dozen checks in different amounts from James McCord to Bernard Fensterwald's committee during a period in which McCord and Fensterwald were not supposed to have known each other. Fensterwald is a gentleman who runs a committee to investigate assassinations in Washington and is suspected by two-thirds of the researchers of having links to the CIA. Well, just in the last 2 weeks, I was reading the executive session of the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 22, Testimony, March 22nd, 1974, page 10250, for those of you that want to look this up. This is some more of the Senate Select Committee hearings that were not televised, but were done privately, and they're published by the Government Printing Office. And in Volume 22, Rosemary Woods gives a little more description of Lou Russell, who died shortly after Watergate. And she said Lou Russell used to come into the White House, see Rosemary Woods, and see Richard Nixon, that he formerly worked with the House On-American Activities and visited Rosemary Wood for recommendation, and then worked for McCord Associates. Mr. Lenzer, from the Senate committee, said, "Did you determine the relationship between Mr. Larry O'Brien and Robert Maheu? And when you talked to Mr. Russell, did he indicate to you that he had been previously employed by Robert Maheu here in Washington?" Well, shortly after the Watergate story broke, Lou Russell, who worked for James McCord, who evidently worked for Robert Maheu, was found dead, just like Lee Pennington, who was at McCord's home destroying the links of the CIA to Watergate, was also found dead. And I think that the links, the investigation of the links of Lou Russell, not only to James McCord and to early Nixon days, but to Robert Maheu, is an important explanation of possibly why Mr. Lou Russell died, just like Beverly Kay, the secretary who typed up those missing 18 minutes of the missing tapes, died at the White House. Mr. Pennington died. Well, Lou Russell died. But again, he had contacts not only to McCord and the House On-American Activity with Richard Nixon, but he died, and he had a link to the Hughes organization through Mr. Maheu. Remember, Sam Giancana, we'll mention it briefly again, the mafia boss who died before he was supposed to testify before the Senate committee just a few weeks ago. He was contacted through Mr. Maheu, who worked for the Hughes Corporation. Maheu got immunity. Giancano died. In this case, Lou Russell died. Another gentleman died just in June who should have made the headlines. Shocking testimony. I'm trying to get a hold of the original testimony in Washington. His name is Colonel Sheffield Edwards, and he died in June 1975 after testifying before the Senate committee. He gave secret testimony to the Senate committee investigating the CIA, domestic activities of the CIA, the same committee that Sam Giancano was to testify before and was killed, and that murder is just hushed up. You don't read a thing about in the paper. Well, Colonel Sheffield Edwards died after he testified. Now, I take 8 papers a day and get papers from all over the country. People mail me articles that are very important when I can't subscribe to all these papers. But in the papers I had out here on Colonel Sheffield Edwards, there was an article from the Associated Press in the San Francisco Chronicle dated July 31st, and it said that Robert Maheu was contacted in 1960 by CIA officer James O'Connell. This has to do, this information, with the attempted assassination of Castro. James O'Connell asked me to contact a Mr. Roselli in Los Angeles, and we would meet with Sam Gold, who was Sam Giancano, in Miami, where Maheu and Roselli joined him. Now, that was the San Francisco Chronicle. The Los Angeles Times had a different story. Their own reporter covered the testimony of Maheu, but this is the way they had it. They said that the CIA was giving Maheu $500 a month, that he was approached by James O'Connell, who was a CIA supervisor who previously served as Maheu's contact. Then it went on to say a sentence which was not in the Associated Press story. It says it was evidenced from meetings with O'Connell from the CIA and later sessions with Colonel Sheffield Edwards, then CIA Director of Security, that the CIA wanted Castro killed. O'Connell is now retired, and Edwards, who died earlier this month, gave secret testimony to the Senate committee in June. Now, how did this gentleman, Mr. Sheffield Edwards, die? He was the CIA Director of Security. How did he die? He testified in June. By July 31st, he was dead. Where did he die? What city did he die in? What was his testimony? I have people in Washington that can get me some grand jury testimony. Get it to me, and secret session testimony, and I'm trying to get the testimony of Mr. Sheffield Edwards. He was the Director of Security of the CIA, and this story was in the Los Angeles Times and not in the Associated Press story that he died. Now, the Washington Post, August the 7th, 1975, referred again to the late Colonel Sheffield Edwards. And it further goes on to say that Edwards was responsible, that he was, it tries to suggest that he was the connecting link. In other words, CIA project officer James O'Connell comes out clean, he's retired, and he contacted Maheu. But the thrust of the blame then is put, in the Washington Post article, the blame is put on the man who's dead, and yet we don't have any way of knowing how he died or when he died, and by his being killed as the cutoff, then whoever Mr. Maheu contacted, Maheu has immunity, Sheffield Edwards is dead, so then you can't take these assassinations or the assassination plots, even the ones that fail, you can't take them up to the White House or to the National Security Council. Washington Post carried an article, and it said Maheu dealt with O'Connell and Sheffield Edwards, but the publishers reported that Edwards was in charge of the operation, and Edwards died recently, end quotes. And that's so convenient of Edwards to die. Now, Maheu, Robert Maheu, was in 1961 in Miami with Roselli and Giancano, and he was working, his biggest client was Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes in 61 urged Maheu to come out to California from Miami in 61, and that's where Maheu went. At the time, Howard Hughes, or the Hughes Corporation, asked Maheu to become part of the CIA so it would cover their operations, so they would be protected from any investigation. According to Robert Maheu, he refused to combine the CIA. He was getting $500 a month from the CIA, and he was representing the Hughes empire all this time. But Maheu claims that in 70 or 71, after he was fired, he learned that the Hughes Corporation and the CIA were in a secret project. So Mr. Edwards is gone. Another witness who died in 1973 was Jack Cleveland, and he had given secret testimony to the Watergate Committee. And the Watergate investigators were looking for links of Richard Nixon's brother, Donald Nixon, and John Meyer, who now lives in Canada, a former consultant to Howard Hughes and to Robert Vesco. And it was in secret session that Robert Maheu said that he was told by Donald Nixon that he and his brother Richard had accounts with Robert Vesco in the Bahamas, and Donald Nixon was interested in buying property, Nye County, Nevada, owned by Jack Cleveland, who was a former Hughes consultant. And Cleveland died quite suddenly in 1973 in Canada. He was a link of the Hughes money, Donald Nixon, an investment in property, and this gentleman died very suddenly in 1973. Another link of Watergate to Hughes and the Hughes empire. General Paul Stalin, I've talked about before in various programs, or a few of them, but in summing up many of these Hughes-related deaths, Paul Stalin died June 2nd, 22nd, 1975. He was the Northrop figure who was run over by a bus. June the 7th, he was run over by a bus. He never recovered. And there was a lot of uproar in Europe, in Paris, the day that the report leaked that Stalin was under the pay of Northrop Corporation, and he was influencing the decision in France to buy American weapons. But then it later turned out he not only was paid by the Northrop Corporation, but he was paid by the Hughes Corporation. It was confirmed that he was on their payroll also. Another accident happened in Washington. Originally it was described as just an accident, a drowning, a man by the name of Merle Baumgart, a car accident, May the 20th, 1975, just 2 months ago. He was a prominent lobbyist, and he had told his family he was afraid for his life. He was the former administrative assistant to Representative Peter Rodino. Rodino was very active in the impeachment work and gathering evidence against Richard Nixon. I don't know how much he knew about the Rebozo money, about the links to Howard Hughes, the dummy fronts, the very heavy link of E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy meeting in the offices with Robert Bennett and James McCord and John Mitchell, where the entries to the Watergate Hotel were planned. And this is the office where the head of that came out to be head of Hughes Corporation Public Relations. Robert Bennett is out there now in Los Angeles. They sat in this office that had Hughes scramblers, $10 million of Hughes money in dummy fronts. They represented Mullen Associates, the ITT, the Hughes Corporation, and Peter Rodino investigating the Watergate. He allegedly, I heard stories about possible links of him in New Jersey to organized crime, and he was getting all this information on the Watergate, which he's accumulated. And his assistant, his former assistant, who just left him recently by the name of Merle Baumgart, was found floating in the Potomac River. His car plunged off the parkway into the river. It was called a traffic accident. He died of a broken neck and fractured skull. And it was only when they got police got an anonymous phone call, look into this, it was murder. And then an investigation, they found out that May the 10th, that Baumgart's car was forced to the side of the parkway, and he told the police that a man had smashed his car windows, that they came up and stopped him and smashed his windows and threatened him. And he was living in fear for his life for 10 days, and then his car went into the water. He was with a woman, 27-year-old woman, who was driving. Charges were dropped from her. It was called reckless driving. She was completely safe, not hurt. Everything was fine as far as she went, but he had a broken neck and a fractured skull. Rodino said that Baumgart was his chief assistant up through 1973, and he saw him the week before he was killed. The U.S. agents are probing his death, and there's a lot of secrecy into the investigation of his death. There's an article in the Oregonian I got from some radio fans up in Oregon that said, in quote, sources describe the police investigation as sensitive because the stature of some individuals may be involved. And the Star, another newspaper, reported that a lot of efforts were being put to squash this investigation and keep it quiet because it involved individuals with good jobs on Capitol Hill that were involved, and that they had to protect the reputation of various people. We don't know who they're protecting or what's behind Dino's assistant, but again, this was a important figure. A Justice Department strike force on organized crime is investigating the death, and knowing the material, the hot, sensitive material that these people have that they haven't yet unfolded, all of these deaths that are related to these committees and their information should be investigated, just as I still think Martha Mitchell's kidnapping wasn't investigated properly, the people weren't reprimanded, and the Watergate story, the real story of the links of Hunt and Liddy and Mitchell to the Hughes, the organized crime, the CIA, has not really been told. Sam Giancana was another one I mentioned, who died June 20th, shot 6 times in the head and neck, hired by Robert Maheu from the CIA, Hughes, and FBI. Maheu represented all 3 of those in an area that is interlocking, and they're interlocking in the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. Giancana was to testify before the Senate committee when he was killed, and Mr. Roselli, his partner, John Roselli, hired by Maheu, I think I mentioned it before on Dialogue Conspiracy, was represented in a law case by Grant Cooper, who then went to his next client, Sirhan, and the interlocking of even the lawyers that represent a selected patsy in this case have relationships and ties to organized crime, the Hughes organization. The same lawyer comes in on the Sirhan case that represents these other persons, such as John Roselli. Joseph Bush in Los Angeles died June 27, 1975. The front page of the Los Angeles Times, dated July 13th, says, "Robert Kennedy case still questioned." And it's a long article on the Robert Kennedy assassination, and then the article says, in quotes, "Just before his death on June 27th, District Attorney Joseph Bush had considered ways to reopen the aspects of the RFK case, possibly through a special group appointed by the California Supreme Court." And shortly after that, Joseph Bush, he made a decision to have a special group. He called Elville Younger, I understand, according to Ted Chirac, he said last week, and was angered about this whole matter of the Robert Kennedy assassination. And just about before night could fall, Joseph Bush was dead from a heart attack, and that ended his investigation into the Robert Kennedy assassination. Now, the alleged assassin of Robert Kennedy, the man who had a second gun, who shot a second gun, came from Lockheed. He was a special maintenance man at Lockheed, and there's an interlocking of a name here that is important to the research, Mr. Golden, Jim Golden. And in that context, I'll talk about him. Jim Golden was Richard Nixon's bodyguard in 1956. 2 men accompanied Richard Nixon wherever he went. And Richard Nixon lost the election in 1960. He was supposed to win the transition from Eisenhower's vice president on through these Cold War years. Richard Nixon was that selected president, and he lost in 1960 to John Kennedy. In 1968, Mr. Golden, who was Richard Nixon's bodyguard, is working at Lockheed up until 1968. At what time he came to California in 60 and then went to work at Lockheed. And I think it would be very important to get the documents. It would be impossible to subpoena and get the truth, I suppose, on this matter if Mr. Golden, Richard Nixon's bodyguard, knew Thane Caesar, who became Robert Kennedy's bodyguard the night that he was shot in the Ambassador Hotel. But just by coincidence, Mr. Golden is at Lockheed, and then where does he go from there? Jim Golden, from bodyguarding Richard Nixon in 56, he's at Lockheed at 68, the same time that Thane Caesar is at Lockheed and is to go to the Ambassador Hotel. Mr. Golden is in Las Vegas in 1970, moving Howard Hughes to the Bahamas and to London, accompanying Howard Hughes. There was no Hughes, there was no body of Hughes that left Las Vegas. So whatever emotions they went through, Golden is part and was part of this giant conspiracy. and then became vice president of Intertel, and we're going to talk a little bit about Intertel that I think is one of the cruxes of so-called retired officials that are doing all of these giant conspiracies. They've left the agency so that the agency isn't conspiring against us any more than the CIA overthrew our election in 72. E. Howard Hunt did and James McCord did. They, in quotes, were retired. Well, Jim Golden went from accompanying Richard Nixon as vice president out to Lockheed, where Thane Caesar was, and then moving this Hughes body, whatever it was, he became the vice president of Intertel with its headquarters in the Bahamas, weaving in and out of the White House with Rosemary Woods and Richard Nixon up till 73, and in 75 he's working for LEAA in Washington, D.C., which is the network and backwork of that Gestapo McCord was talking about. Another person was murdered, the wife of a Lockheed aircraft executive. Very suddenly hushed up. There were 3 murders in Los Angeles, July 26, just a week ago. Gloria Witt, W-I-T-T-E. Her husband is Roland Witt, executive of Lockheed Aircraft. And we don't know whether she is a Dorothy Hunt, a female agent, along with her husband, but the circumstances of this woman being shot are very suspicious. Yes, it can happen that people walk the streets and get shot, and they're not conspiracies. But one of the things that always makes me suspicious, like Sam Giancana or Gloria Witt, is that the case is hushed up immediately. When it is a homicide, the FBI can solve it, the police can solve it, the newspaper is full of it. When it's a conspiracy, front page, off it goes. You don't hear about it. Like Carlo the terrorist in Europe that I want to bring up more. Gloria Witt was walking with her husband and some friends. There was some shotgun blasts. They fired 7 or 8 times, and the quotation in the news was she was just executed. They walked up and executed her. Her husband is Roland Witt from Lockheed. Does he know Jim Golden? Did he know Thane Caesar? Who is this woman, the executive of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, who's gunned down in front of a $100,000 home in Los Angeles? Not another thing on the newspaper after that. And when I read Lockheed, my eyes pop up. Another section, people afraid for their lives. There was an article this is the New York Times, dated June the 20th. People in the grain corruption inquiry in fear of their lives. And this has to do with New Orleans, the investigation of corruption, of handling and weighting of grain in major American ports. Now, why is a grain story important to the conspiracy? In the book Were We Controlled, that I've mentioned many times, written by Lincoln Lawrence, that's a pseudonym, in 1967, it's a story of the Kennedy assassination. It's a book on behavior modification and hypnotism involved on Oswald and Ruby. And this book was based upon a short, diabolical plot to kill JFK. It was a 58-page story circulating in Chicago by a man named David Warren. David Warren, incidentally, Warren was one of the pen names that E. Howard Hunt used. This little book came out after the Bay of Pigs operation. Hunt had strong contacts in Chicago. The book was located in Chicago. But the theme of the book was that there was what they called a rumor that they checked out to be true, that the stock market, the day that John Kennedy died, was manipulated, not by accident, on November 22nd, 1963, that somebody wanted it manipulated, and somebody was plunging it short and made $500 million that day. It had to do with the oil and corn and grain commodities. And the allegation of this book was that only someone who knew the president was going to be killed could have sold short that day and made $500 million. And then the book goes on to name the Bunch Corporation, the same corporation in New Orleans that is under question now, and question of their indictments. And the links of this particular corporation, B-U-N-G-E, the Bunch Corporation that has just been indicted recently, is named in the book Were We Controlled? And they used the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation in New Jersey for the manipulation of the market to make $500 million. Now this is important because the Bunch Corporation, with its links to Germany and former Nazis heavily controlled by Germans to Argentina to New Orleans, set up their headquarters in New Orleans in 1961. And it was Clay Shaw's office. Clay Shaw worked out of the International Trade Mart. Clay Shaw worked through Permindex with the international Nazis. Clay Shaw, David Ferry, Guy Bannister, Lee Harvey Oswald, Albert Osborne were all working for the Central Intelligence Agency in New Orleans in 1963, and certainly from 61 to 63 these people were organized since the Bay of Pigs. And it's interesting that at this time this particular corporation is being indicted for manipulations and various charges at this time. But I think that the fear of their lives has more to do with the possible investigation, not into grain corruption, as it has to do with possible links to the Kennedy assassination. I think that if good investigators, investigative reporters would go into the Bunge Corporation and the possibility of the links to Clay Shaw, they would find many of the answers that were asked in the book, Were We Controlled? And I think that the fear of the lives down there has more to do with the history of the early 60s than it has to adding a little dirt to the scales at this time. One witness came out this week and said, my husband would wind up in the river if he talked. I'd be a widow. My children would be fatherless. If he ever tells what he knows, we'll be killed. And another witness said they wanted their name withheld, that they're receiving death threats from investigators down there. And another witness said that hired killers are loose down there and they're looking for former federal grain inspectors. 20 indictments have been returned, and there is an investigation into the Bunge Corporation and other grain corporations down there. But it is interesting that after the assassination in 63, it's 75, and the same corporation that was named and Were We Controlled is still manipulating the economy in some way. And if, again, it is properly investigated, we would find these links to the Kennedy assassination that should be gone into. Now, who is behind all of this vague organization? One person whose name interlocks, as well as Mr. Golden, who worked with Richard Nixon, is Richard Danner. Richard Danner managed Mr. Smathers' first political campaign in Florida, and Mr. Smathers was instrumental in holding Richard Nixon up when he prosecuted Alger Hiss. And Mr. Danner handed Bibi Rebozo $100,000 allegedly from the Hughes money that stayed in banks and didn't draw interest, that was sitting there for 2-3 years, that was used for clandestine operations, that wasn't going to the committee to re-elect the president. Richard Danner's links to Smathers, George Smathers, senator from Florida, and Richard Nixon's meeting Smathers and going to Florida to meet Bibi Rebozo. I've called Rebozo his CIA babysitter for a long time. And I think the important thing is that men in government, high up in our government, retired, in quotes, retired, for the government wouldn't be called a dictatorship run by the CIA or Gestapo. And various men retired, and as of 1970, taking somebody from the Justice Department, Robert Pelican, they formed an organization called Intertel. Intertel was formed in 1970. Penn Jones Jr. writes it up in his book, Volume 4, page 70 to 71, about Intertel as a very silk-stocking private agency, a very secret organization of retired people, but not ordinary people. Their clients are Hughes and ITT. There was a wonderful article about Intertel in Harper's, December 74, called Hire a Spy. But just in the few minutes that are left, let me tell you the kind of people that belong to Intertel. Now, Intertel was formed in 1970, and it allegedly was formed, or believed to have taken Howard Hughes from Vegas to the Bahamas. But you don't use this kind of energy and manpower to move a 70-year-old vegetable to the top floor of a building that has no elevator buttons beyond the floor below and guard this thing that doesn't even exist. Some of the men, this is a list of some of the men who've begun to work for Intertel, and I believe that they can be doing this hidden manipulating in every state or country and getting tighter control of the government each day and taking over solidly the Hughes empire. After 70, when this Hughes person didn't exist, they could take the wealth, the power, and the agents. They have the ability to manipulate through their expertise. Here are some of the people. The chief of Intertel was a special projects section director of the National Security Agency. The director of intelligence and Intertel security used to work for the Internal Revenue. The deputy director of security worked for the National Security Agency. Their chief was in the Intelligence Division of Organized Crime Strike Force, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Their deputy director of security was in the United States Department of State. One of their executives was a supervisor of intelligence activities in the FBI. One of their chairmen was head of the Criminal Intelligence Services of Ontario, Canada. Another commissioner was head of Scotland Yard. He was commissioner of Scotland Yard at one time. The supervisor of espionage and Intertel security was a former agent of the FBI and worked for internal security investigations. They have a senior advisor from the U.S. Department of State from Southeast Asia. They have a coordinator of Interpol operations from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They have a supervisor from organized crime and intelligence squads from the Internal Revenue Service. They have an agent from the Chief Justice Department Organized Crime Strike Force, detective supervisor, Special Investigative Unit, formerly Narcotics Squad, the New York Police. The director of enforcement was from the U.S. Bureau of Customs. Their chief market surveillance section was from the Security Exchange Commission. J. Edgar Hoover's only nephew works for Intertel. There are more than 50 professional special agents from the government. More than 50 professional special agents from the government. Intertel's director of intelligence operation is Edward R. Mullen, formerly of the FBI and the CIA. They represent ITT, Howard Hughes, and they moved whatever this body was to the Bahamas, and the Hughes empire has been taken apart. Intertel was formed in 70. It then fired Robert Maheu. He claims that there was always a desire to link the CIA to the Hughes empire, and when Robert Maheu was out, he was crying. He claimed that Howard Hughes was kidnapped in 1970 and taken from Vegas. He didn't see him all the time he was in Vegas. The Summa Corporation, which belonged to Howard Hughes, which does $800 million worth of business with the government, uses the president, but all the money that's authorized goes to the Hughes Medical Foundation. The Hughes Tool Company was sold in 1972. Hughes was the sole stock holder. The person who bought it has never seen Howard Hughes. A Dr. Albert Whelan is the vice president now of the Tool Company. He worked for Space and Communications. He joined the Hughes empire. He was from the CIA. A researcher from the CIA joined Hughes in 1966. This is a lot of material of, I hope it isn't too much jumbling or jumping around for you, because I'm trying to put it in some written form that I can publish and relate to you, but hidden behind the secret of Howard Hughes not being seen for 20 years, selling the Tool Company, taking over the Summa Corporation, Maheu saying he was kidnapped, forming the Intertel with high government officials, and no proof that they're not still government. It's very possible that those satellites up there that control where food is and where fish are and control the weather are controlled by the government under, in quotes, private enterprise, but actually are government intelligence agents, similar to a Gestapo, the FBI and CIA, not retired, still communicating with the federal government and have their tacit approval. Otherwise, the government would investigate Howard Hughes, private citizen, and find out if he's dead or alive, and if he was in fact kidnapped. But there's no police to do it, because Intertel is made up of 50 or more top government officials, and they guard the doors and the finances and the money that was once the Hughes empire. Well, that's it for this week. Our time is over. I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy. And if the news is quiet along this front, we'll get back to Gerald Ford's book, The Portrait of the Assassin.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KELRV FM in Carmel, California.